Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 120 Critical Thinking. Today's focus is language, where we keep on building our toolkit on different concepts and ideas we can use to analyze and evaluate arguments. And today it's all about the ways that words and language affect our thinking. So we won't be digging into like some deep psychological aspects, things like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or a few other ideas that honestly, if we had the time, would be fantastic to add into this. Instead, though, we're going to look at how language affects arguments and reasoning specifically, rather than general patterns of thought. So the way that we'll do this is we'll do a brief overview of just the general idea of language affecting thought, how word choice affects things. We'll also look at charged and emotionally loaded language and how this affects our perceptions of various topics. We'll spend a little bit of time on different sorts of confusions and clarity, and how these sorts of things can affect arguments and how they can sometimes lead to fallacious reasoning if we're not careful. We'll also look at a few different kinds of definitions that we can use to be more precise and more clear in our arguments and in our critical thinking. So start off with, I have just a little bit of food for thought for you, just something to throw around. If we're talking about unborn human beings, that is, human beings before they're born from their mothers, which of the two terms do you find just generally more appealing? Referring to that unborn human as a baby, as a lot of people do and a lot of pregnant moms do, or referring to it as a fetus, the way that medical textbooks and other things do? Depending on which one appeals to you more, that may say certain things about your backgrounds or your interests and that sort of thing. But more interesting, I think, is how that choice of term affects how we react to the unborn person. For one, referring to a fetus or an unborn child as one of those two things, or even as an unborn person, changes what we'd be willing to do for it. Depending on looking at each of these two different terms, baby and fetus, which of the two would you be more likely to protect or advocate for? How does that word choice affect how willing you would be to terminate a pregnancy in order to protect the mother's life? This sort of word choice, this sort of choice in language, affects the way not only that we perceive certain things, but the way that we react to it. And we see this especially when we look at the different sides of the American abortion debate. Each of the two different sides generally are referred to by the labels pro-choice and pro-life. And it's interesting to note that both of these are intended to be very positive sounding terms. This is far different than simply calling the two sides pro-abortion and anti-abortion. Pro-choice sounds much more appealing than the idea of being anti-abortion, but at the same time, it's also somewhat more accurate. It's not just more loaded, it's not just something that's more positive and puts a nice spin on everything, but it also more accurately describes the kind of position that people are fighting for. And that's the idea of being able to make a choice about regarding one's own body and the things that go on with it. At the same time, the opposing position is not anti-abortion, but is rather the pro-life movement, which again phrases a position in a far more appealing way. It's no longer an anti-position. It's about being for and in support of protecting something, rather than being just merely a group that condemns a certain kind of activity. And again, depending on the individual person or the individual group, it might also be more accurate in places, in that there are plenty of anti-abortion groups, if we want to use that sort of term, that do still allow for abortions under certain circumstances. And again, I don't want to dig up the whole can of worms, but rather simply just point out how this kind of word choice has drastically shaped one of the most divisive debates in contemporary American history. It's, I think, a clear bit of evidence and a clear example on how language matters when we're dealing with persuasion and argument. The names and the labels that we attach to things and the definitions that we attach to things very, very much affects how we actually end up reasoning and thinking about the problems and the challenges that we face in the world. Now, both of the terms I just mentioned, the pro-choice and pro-life sides of the abortion debate, these are both examples of what we can call emotionally charged language, or just speak a little bit more simply, something called loaded language. Now, emotionally charged language generally sets a mood or an emotional tone without actually providing any arguments or reasoning at all. If we go back and look at these two names of the different sides, pro-choice and pro-life, both of these have certain emotional connotations and connections, different associations attached to those words. And yet, and they use these to have a certain sort of appeal to their position. I mean, who wants to say that they're anti-life? If you label yourself as being a pro-life group, you're sort of stacking the table in your favor in terms of persuasion. You're making the job of persuading somebody to join your side all the easier to a certain extent. And so using this kind of loaded language, using this kind of emotionally charged language, can go a long way for setting moods and emotions and bringing people over to your side without actually even saying a single word of argument or offering a single bit of reasoning. And sometimes that's perfectly fine. It's not necessarily a bad thing to use emotionally charged language. It often can help show one's assumptions and attitudes without having to go through the process of offering evidence for these sorts of things. Just like we use tropes in movies to, save the viewer a little bit of brain power as they view things. The menacing fellow in black who carries a red lightsaber or whatever else in Star Wars is very obviously the bad guy. Like if you go back to the original 1970s Star Wars, the one that started the whole thing, within the first 5 to 10 minutes of the movie, you have a very clear idea of who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, simply by visual symbols and things that we've grown accustomed to over the course of our media consuming lives. Those tropes, those symbols, those little ingredients and shortcuts convey a certain sort of tone to us without ever actually having to tell us that Darth Vader is a bad person and is going to be the villain of this particular story. In the same way, emotionally charged language can provide shortcuts and basically a shorthand for us to communicate our assumptions and attitudes without having to go through further argumentation or explanation. At the same time, though, it is sometimes used as a replacement for argument, and it can also express and perpetuate bias. In the same way that being pro-life makes it easier to persuade people to join your side, it also seems to cast your opponent in an assumed negative light. It automatically starts painting your intellectual opponent on this sort of thing as a bad person who's against this very valuable thing. The same way if we were choosing between the terms baby and fetus. One seems far more medical and cold, whereas the other one seems warm and inviting and encouraging in a lot of ways. And so this emotionally charged language can be useful, but it also runs the risk of simply biasing people towards positions without actually giving any real evidence or reasoning in favor or against those positions. And since we want to be better critical thinkers, bringing people to positions without thinking or without reasoning honestly just seems like a irresponsible sort of thing to do. Now, the opposite of emotionally charged language, neutral language, is the sort of thing that conveys information in a neutral emotional tone. That is, it lays things out clearly and without bias and without heavy emotional connotations. And when I talk about connotations, I literally just mean the associations that come with the words. And so neutral language lacks a lot of the emotional connotations and connections that we see with loaded language. But even though neutral language can avoid this biasing and influencing ability that loaded language has, it's not always desirable that we do everything in purely neutral language. For one, just to be blunt about it and to sort of avoid a little bit of neutral language, if everything were written in neutral language, it'd be boring as hell. I just imagine a world written in the same way as legal contracts and instruction manuals, things that aim to be perfectly clear, but lack the color and depth of expression that ordinary language often has to it. And even in that description, we can see that if I were to purely speak in neutral terms that didn't have some of the connotations and color to it that emotionally charged language would, like things like ordinary language, if I instead phrased it as language the way we all, that most people often use it or something like that, we start getting this really clunky, this really dry, this really boring way of presenting our ideas. And it honestly just makes convincing people much harder, and it sucks a lot of the joy out of life, even though that's a very vague and a very ill-defined sort of criticism of neutral language. It is very much one that's true. So, uh, when we're dealing with language, these two distinctions between emotionally charged language and neutral language are useful ones to keep in mind, because if we can identify these sorts of things, we can, for one, start to be on the lookout for them and adjust for them. We can realize what's happening to us when we read or perceive an argument that's built up with loaded language and emotionally charged language. And it also gives us a tool to use at times when we want to be able to take advantage of these same sorts of shortcuts and these same sorts of influences on people. There may be times if you're writing marketing copy for a company or something, you may need to use or want to use loaded language to help create a certain sort of image for the product that you're advertising. Or maybe you work for a nonprofit and you need to make it clear in a very simple way what it is you guys actually stand for. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to use strong, charged language, loaded language that conveys an emotional tone without having to say, okay, this is who we are, these are our points, these are our reasons for our points. Instead of handing out pamphlets, you hand out flyers or buttons or things with slogans and colorful loaded language that makes your point abundantly clear. And the effects of this on politics and business in general are, of course, I think, to a certain extent obvious or well documented. This kind of stuff's useful just as much as it is dangerous, and as much as it is, to a certain extent, irresponsible if used badly or as a replacement for actual argument and reasoning. Now, another extreme form of emotionally charged language is what we often refer to as euphemism. And this is something that a lot of you have probably heard of before, or probably dealt with before. Euphemisms are bland, polite, and abstract language that intentionally hides unpleasant, uncomfortable, or just sort of terrible topics. And this is the sort of thing we get a lot with just anything in life that's uncomfortable. For example, in American English, we often use the term passed away instead of just simply saying that someone died. And this seems because we do this because saying someone passed away seems a lot more gentle, a lot less uncomfortable than saying someone died, or we might say that they're no longer here. We might talk about the late John Smith or something like that. John Smith, if he died last week, is not just late. He's never showing up again. But instead, we generally like to use this more polite, this more comfortable language to gloss over the uncomfortable topics that we don't want to deal with. And in a lot of cases, this is entirely harmless. Again, we do this sort of thing all the time in ordinary language. But in some other situations, it can block understanding of important issues and stop us from actually critically thinking about things. So noticing euphemism is something that is aspiring critical thinkers that we need to do so that we can intentionally choose to move past it or to set it aside when we need to deal with uncomfortable topics. some instances of euphemism, like I said, are perfectly harmless. We have the instance of talking about someone who's passed away versus someone who's died. We might also have terms like sanitation engineer as a term for the people who come and collect the garbage from the side of the road. And in some instances, this may be an example of something being more accurate, but it also just generally spares people's feelings. It stops a lot of derogatory language. Calling somebody the trash man or the garbage man uh, often can be a little bit uncomfortable. Not just that we don't want to talk about garbage, but we might actually be hurting somebody's feelings or degrading them a little bit, depending on how the term is used and the tone that it's presented in. So a term like sanitation engineer can be perfectly fine. But at the same time, we also have instances of using euphemism to hide things that we really should be discussing and dealing with, like the whole controversy surrounding enhanced interrogation in the years immediately following 9/11. During the George W. Bush administration, there was the presidential administration, there was a significant amount of controversy about whether or not certain interrogation techniques, quote unquote, like waterboarding, were actually constituted torture or not. Because, as a matter of international law, we're not allowed to torture certain individuals, or really anyone. Torture is wrong in a lot of instances, if not all of them. A little bit of an open moral question. But regardless, our official stance as a nation, the one offered by the executive branch of our government, was that we don't torture. We simply used enhanced interrogation techniques to try and convince people to divulge information about their allies or who had trained them or whoever else. And when we start using language like that, when we start using that sort of euphemism, we're really covering up the sort of debates that we really ought to be having. As a nation, we really should have been engaging more with the idea of, are we really a nation that tortures? Are we really a nation that says that this is a necessary thing for us to accomplish our goals? And is this necessary to protect people? If we start talking instead about enhanced interrogation, it becomes much harder to fully appreciate the weight of the issues that we're dealing with, and we may not engage them as deeply or as critically as we would if we actually had the more controversial term torture being used in our vocabularies. So choice of words, particularly in difficult situations, matters quite a lot. And this goes doubly so when we're trying to be clear in our language. When we're thinking critically, we want to try and be as clear in our language as possible. In fact, we might even sort of create a zeroth commandment or a first commandment of critical thinking. When in doubt, be more clear. Because when we're not clear in our language, we're generally not being clear in our thinking. Clear language is the sort of thing that accurately and with definitive and distinct terms lays out the kinds of things that we're talking about. It makes it obvious what topics we're discussing and what we mean by the words and the ideas that we put forward. The opposite of this sort of thing, or one of the concerns that we have with clarity, is trying to avoid what we call ambiguity. And in ordinary language, we use ambiguity often in a very loose and vague sort of way. We usually mean something like, oh, if that's ambiguous, it's just kind of confusing, or I don't really know what you mean. And that's true in our case as well, but we ought to be a little more specific. Again, when in doubt, be more clear. And strictly speaking, ambiguity is when a term has multiple possible meanings that make sense in context, which often leads to confusion or bad reasoning or just simple miscommunication. And generally, there are two sorts of ambiguity that show up in reasoning: semantic ambiguity and syntactic ambiguity. Semantic ambiguity is the most straightforward. This is when the context that a word shows up in doesn't give us enough information to choose between meanings. And like here at the bottom of the slide, I've got just the simple little line, evolution is a theory. Well, depending on how that's presented or what context it's coming in, that term theory might actually mean multiple different things. I could be meaning evolution is just a theory. And here I'm meaning the term theory in the sense of a guess or an attempt at an explanation, but nothing that's settled. Or I could be meaning it in the more technical scientific sense, in which being a theory is far, far more than being just a simple guess at an answer to a problem. Instead, it's a well tested hypothesis that's widely accepted to a certain degree. So, here, the term theory means either of these two different things, and only context can inform us which of those two meanings is involved. Now, I could add other things to the sentence, like saying that evolution is just a theory, and then all of a sudden, which of the two terms I mean becomes a whole lot more clear. Because with that extra sort of qualifying word just, I've sort of lowered my opinion of what a theory is, and that comes across in the sentence that I'm offering. And it becomes much more clear that I'm meaning theory in the lesser, just a guess sort of sense. And syntactic ambiguity is when that order and structure of a sentence that specifically leads to some sort of confusion. So in the first sense, with semantic ambiguity, here we have an ambiguity in the meaning of a word. Like literally, which of the definitions for this are you intending to use? Because I don't know what you mean in this situation. With syntactic ambiguity, the ambiguity comes from the order and the structure of a phrase or a sentence. So rather than coming from context and word definitions, here we're just unclear of what job the word is doing in the sentence. We might be dealing with something like, John was upset because Robert murdered his wife. Now here, we could mean his wife in a couple of different ways. The structure of the sentence doesn't make it clear whether it's John's wife that was killed or whether Robert murdered his own wife and John is upset because Robert's a murderer. Either one of these makes perfect sense given the context and the structure of the sentence we're dealing with. And English and non-inflected languages in general are particularly prone to this kind of thing. A lot of languages like German or older ones like Latin, heavily inflected languages, these often have the words change shape and change form to indicate what function a given term is performing in a sentence. So in this case, we might know which of the two men's wives was killed by Robert. And so we might have a much clearer picture of what's going on. English, though, we do have to worry about this. So when analyzing things, it's worth it to be careful of the order and structure of our sentences and to notice when someone might be relying on this kind of equivocation or this kind of confusion. Because ambiguity is a worry, not just because it's harder to understand, but because in reasoning, it can actually lead to straight up bad reasoning that we shouldn't trust to a certain extent. And this is what's called the fallacy of equivocation. In general, a fallacy is a mistaken argument or a part of an argument that's based on a very common misconception or a mistake in thinking. The fallacy of equivocation happens when an argument has an ambiguous key term and the premises of that argument only support the conclusion because of a lack of distinction between those definitions. Take something like the one here at the bottom. Sure, philosophy helps you argue better, but do we really need to encourage people to argue? There's enough hostility in the world. This is a very simple sort of argument that implies that we shouldn't encourage more argument in the world, that philosophy maybe shouldn't be something that's taught. But here, as you guys should know at this point, the argument's relying on a confusion and ambiguity in the word argue. There's the ordinary sense of the term in which people fight and argue and are hostile to each other and are shouting and whatever else. And then there's the sense that we mean, the sense of building sets of statements to support claims and conclusions with reasons. Philosophy definitely helps you form arguments in the technical sense better, But I imagine that philosophy doesn't actually make you any better at shouting at your wife or anything like that, and I would hope that overall it doesn't. So here the argument only works if you have a confusion in the term argue, and then you use both sides of that confusion. You're essentially flip-flopping between which sense of the word you mean, and it's just somewhat disingenuous. You're If we had more specific words and definitions for things, this argument maybe wouldn't work at all if we were able to rewrite it with the clearer definitions in mind. A similar sort of problem, but overall different from that of ambiguity, is an issue of vagueness. A term is vague when it has no clear or distinct meaning in context. We might think of words as sort of like marking out little territories of meaning and having fences and borders surrounding the stuff that they refer to and what they mean. Ambiguous terms have multiple sets of fences. They mark off several different and distinct, though possibly related, areas of meaning. Vague terms don't have good fences. They've got holes or gaps, or maybe they're missing fences entirely. They don't mark off different areas of meaning well at all. So, vagueness is a specific kind of confusion that causes issues in reasoning precisely because of a lack of clearly defined meanings. Vague claims are difficult to prove true or false. If we use terms or words that don't have clearly marked meanings, then it's hard for us to tell when we've actually shown that the statement or the premise being offered isn't true, or when it is. We may not know really what's going on. Vague terms are also not usually very informative. They don't actually tell us much of anything about the world. Think about the sort of terms used by a lot of companies in their advertising. Think about things like the fast internet that's advertised by a lot of internet providers. Most of the time, internet service providers advertise fast internet of a certain speed. And they'll, in the fine print, say that you're paying for internet up to a certain speed, or they'll guarantee you fast internet. But without defining what fast internet actually means, it can mean all sorts of things. Compared to 1999, every internet service provider in the world provides fast internet. But that doesn't mean that it's actually fast for today's world, or for anything that we do. Excuse me, had to deal with a cat problem. So, vague terms run the risk of essentially being unable to prove them right or wrong, or being able to use them accurately. And it's not easy to understand the kinds of ideas or the things that we're working with if we're having to deal with vague language. So this is another thing to watch out for, and something that can lead to mistakes in reasoning, and sometimes even just pure miscommunication. Now, the way to avoid this stuff is by having better definitions. We usually avoid the kinds of confusions offered by vague and ambiguous language by having good definitions for our terms. And this is kind of a no-duh kind of moment for most of you, I imagine. But it's perhaps more important to know about and be able to identify which sort of definitions are being offered to us than it is just to say, oh yeah, you should give definitions for things. Because that's a good general practice term for this good general practice rule for sure. But it's one that probably most of us would have just already known to do, hopefully. But definitions do come in a few different kinds, and it's useful to be able to recognize what sort of definitions being offered in a given context, and to know some of the weaknesses and strengths that go along with that. Because those weaknesses and strengths help us identify, well, what confusions might still be here, or is this actually solving the problem that they think it solves? It gives us a better ground for analyzing and evaluating ideas and arguments. So let's run through rather quickly a few different kinds of definitions. So first off, we might have the very basic ostensive definition. An ostensive definition is when we define something by essentially pointing to an example of that thing. Like if somebody were to ask you, what's a mango? And if you held up a mango and pointed to it and said, here, this is one, well, then effectively you're offering an ostensive definition. This is something that's hard to do in writing, but in actual person to person conversation and connection and communication, this is something that happens very, very often. This is something that kids especially like to do, or that we like to do with kids. Because it's nice, it's straightforward, it's clear, and it's especially fantastic for things that have sensory information to them. If we're wanting to clarify what we mean by blue, or what a color is, or what something looks like, being able to point to and indicate that thing makes it abundantly clear what we mean. But when we're dealing with more abstract topics, we sometimes don't always mark the relevant aspects of something when we offer an ostensive definition. For example, we might be wondering what courage is. We might say want to be doing an ethical debate. We might want to define what courage actually is. What does it take to be courageous? Well, finding somebody who's courageous, or finding an example of courageous behavior and saying, here, I don't know what all the details of it are, but that's courage. Well, that's not always very informative. If I want to know what a hero is or what a patriot is, pointing to somebody who is a hero or a patriot might work well to give me some general, vague sort of sense of what the word means or what the concept is. But it doesn't actually give me what I'm looking for. So especially with abstract topics, ostensive definitions have some serious weaknesses. We might also give reportive or lexical definitions, and these are the literal, non-figurative meanings of words. This is the kind of thing that you find when you crack open a dictionary and look for terms in that sort of situation. You're looking for the non-metaphorical, the non-literary, just straightforward, how is this word actually used out in the real world? And so these are nice and clear and direct, but depending on the context or how many definitions a word might have, this doesn't actually always avoid ambiguity and vagueness. Depending on what the definition actually is, it might be too broad. It might be a very vague definition that you've offered. Or a word might have multiple meanings, might have multiple possible definitions. And so offering a reportive or a lexical definition, cracking open the dictionary and saying, this word means this, doesn't always solve those kinds of confusions that we might hope that it does. So going straight for a dictionary is not always the best route when we want to clear up these language issues. Now, one thing we can also do is offer what's called a stipulative definition. And this is effectively where we define how we're going to use the term. This is the kind of thing that we did very early on in the semester when I offered a definition for argument. I said, effectively, we're going to use the word argument like this. That was giving a stipulative definition. It's where we're specifying how we ourselves are going to be using the term. You often see like signs and evidence of this when we say, for our purposes, or I'm going to use the word to mean this. Usually you have to come out and say how you're using a stipulative definition, but every once in a while it's a little more subtle. And this is quite useful because we can be perfectly clear on what it is we actually mean a word to mean, what we intend it to mean. But we do risk what's sometimes referred to as the Humpty Dumpty theory of meaning, which comes from a bit in Alice in Wonderland, where Humpty Dumpty, the character Humpty Dumpty in the fantasy, says something like, well, I can make words mean whatever I want them to mean. And stipulative definitions do run the risk of embracing that kind of idea, because it's possible to start using a word in ways that it normally wouldn't actually be used, and mean things that it wouldn't normally mean. Like, for example, I can offer a stipulative definition of a dragon as being a metal object with 4 wheels that can take you from place to place. But really what I'm talking about is a car. I'm not talking about something that resembles a dragon in the normal sense at all. And while I can offer a stipulative definition that turns a dragon into a car, it's not necessarily a great idea to do so. It's certainly not going to avoid any confusion or unclarity. And if I then start using the term dragon and making certain inferences on it, I might be heading straight for a fallacy of equivocation by having dealt with all of this. And we might also worry about running into persuasive definitions that sometimes run the same sorts of risk that loaded and emotionally charged language do. Stipulative definitions can sometimes disguise uh, themselves as claims or reportive definitions. Basically, you offer one sort of definition and make it look as though it's a uh, just a straight out factual claim or a lexical definition, just saying, "Oh, this is how the word is used." But you end up sort of doing so in a way that it carries over certain emotional connotations that the normal definition itself doesn't actually have. Essentially, you're keeping the emotional connections of a term while changing how it's actually used. And you get this sort of thing a lot when you see terms like true or real. Like, imagine if you were, say, engaging in a political debate with somebody, and they responded with, well, a true American believes yada yada. Well, in this case, they're defining American in a certain way. A true American is someone who believes yada yada. And they're trying to keep the emotional connections that a lot of us would have to the term American. Something that at least United States citizens are going to respond positively to and want to aspire to be. But they're doing so in a way that perhaps adds far, far too much to the definition of American. If I were to say, oh, well, a true American always votes Republican or Democrat or Green Party or whatever, well, that doesn't really seem right. I'm redefining the word American to mean what I want it to mean. I'm using that term now to mean people who agree with me politically. And that's not built into the ordinary definition of American. It's essentially and effectively manipulative to a certain degree. And again, every now and then this is all right. It's not automatically a bad thing, but it is something to be aware of and to be cautious of, particularly when we're identifying and analyzing other people's arguments. Now, with all of these, effectively, this lecture is a whole lot of vocabulary and looking at just a few of the different ways that language can be used in our reasoning and how it can influence reasoning. And it's honestly not an action-packed chapter for us. But starting next time, we're going to start actually looking to apply some of these tools and start actually using these different definitions and senses of vagueness and unclarity to evaluate arguments. We're going to start looking for these things. Because once we have these terms, once we have these tools, we can identify it out in the world, we can notice the parts of an argument that do or don't have these things, and we can use that to evaluate and judge the different ideas that we're asked to evaluate and judge, the things that we have to do in order to live and function and interact with the rest of society. So starting next time, we're going to actually start applying some of the different tools that we've looked at, that we've been building up over the last couple of lectures. We'll use our definitions about language, we'll start seeing whether certain arguments are well put together, and start getting into the real meat of the course. So until then, take a look at the first part of the homeworks, start getting some practice in and applying these different terms. If you like, go ahead and start taking a look at the journal. And until then, or until the next time,